If you want to know when gold gets dangerous in the best possible way, do not start by staring at gold. Start by staring at the paper promises around it. That is the mistake most people make. They watch the metal last. They should be watching the system first. Over my lifetime, I have watched three things repeat more often than they should have. Governments borrow past reason. Policymakers change the rules after assuring everyone they will not. Savers get punished quietly while asset owners get called lucky later. Gold does not create that sequence. Gold simply reveals it. That is why I want to begin where almost nobody wants to begin, with the part that sounds boring until it starts stealing from you debt. Not normal debt. Not the kind a well-run business takes on to build something productive. I mean the kind of debt that crosses the line from large to unpayable. The kind of debt that no serious person believes will ever be retired honestly through disciplined taxation or growth. Once a government reaches that point, the choice set narrows brutally. It can default, which modern developed governments hate because default is loud, embarrassing, and immediate. Or it can make the currency worth less, which feels softer because the theft arrives in fragments. That is the first signal, the point of no return. It is not just that the debt is big. Big debt alone does not light the fuse. The fuse gets lit when the debt becomes mathematically incompatible with the productive power of the system supporting it. When the interest burden becomes permanent. When the political class cannot cut enough. When the public will not tolerate austerity. When growth cannot outrun the promises already made. That is when governments stop behaving like borrowers and start behaving like rule changers. I learned very early that when a man cannot pay you honestly, he starts looking for a new definition of payment. Governments are no different. People like to say the rich have access to hidden loopholes. Most of the time there is nothing hidden at all. The clues are sitting in plain sight. The problem is that they look boring right up until they turn violent. Debt is like that. It looks academic. Then one day you discover that the academic number has moved into your grocery bill, your savings account, your mortgage rate, your pension, and your portfolio multiple all at the same time. That is when gold begins to matter. But again, not first, never first. First comes the debt wall in the 1930s, the United States. Hit a version of that wall after the Depression and the long unwind from war finance in the 1970s. America hit it again after spending promises and monetary excess made the old discipline impossible to maintain. In the 2000s, the same pattern resurfaced after the credit bubble, the bailouts, the wars, and the grand fantasy that more leverage could cure leverage. Today, the numbers are even less subtle. The debt is so large that no adult should pretend it is scheduled to be repaid in money of equal value. That is the first signal. And every time that first signal has appeared, the second one followed close behind. The rules change. This is the part that always offends people because they want to believe the contract is stable. They want to believe the rules of money are fixed, objective, fair, and above politics. They are not. Rules are stable only when the people running the system can still afford to keep them stable. Once they cannot, they rewrite the rules and call the rewrite necessary. Franklin Roosevelt did not knock politely and ask Americans whether they minded surrendering their gold. He changed the terms. He criminalized private ownership, took the gold, then revalued it higher. That was not monetary refinement. That was admission disguised as authority. It was the state confessing that the old price was false and the old promise could not be maintained. Honestly, Nixon did the same thing in different clothing. He did not go on television and say, "We printed too much. The discipline is gone. The gold backing is inconvenient now that we need more room to lie with elegance." He said it would be temporary. Temporary is one of the favorite words of governments. It means permanent with better marketing. Then came the next wave, quantitative easing. A phrase designed to sound clinical, as if money creation had become an exercise in therapeutic moderation rather than a desperate effort to keep an over-leveraged system standing upright. They created trillions, bought financial debris, rescued balance sheets that should have been forced to tell the truth, and called it sophistication. You can track the century by its euphemisms: confiscation, temporary suspension, quantitative easing, liquidity support, emergency facilities, stability measures, different labels, same act. The rules change so the promises can survive in nominal form even when they can no longer survive. Honestly, and now we are living through another rule change, only this time it is diffused across channels instead of announced in one grand speech. That makes it more dangerous because complexity calms the public. People think if it sounds technical enough, it must still be under control. Stablecoin regulation tied to government debt. Monetary easing while inflation has not really died. New forms of artificial demand for sovereign paper, new ways of forcing the system to absorb what the market would otherwise price more harshly. Once you have seen enough of these episodes, you stop asking whether the language is new and start asking whether the objective is old. It is keep the debt machine funded, extend the life of the paper promise, shift the cost away from the issuer and onto the holder of currency. That is the second signal. The rules change. The third signal is the one ordinary savers notice last, even though it is the one that reaches directly into their pocket. Cash stops working. I do not mean the balance goes down. That would be too honest. I mean the number goes up while the value goes down. That is a far more elegant form of theft because it allows the victim to feel prudent while being drained. The bank pays you 2 or 3 or 4% and hands you a small feeling of responsibility. Meanwhile, the real cost of living moves by much more than that. Food rises, insurance rises, housing rises, transport rises, services rise, quality falls while prices rise, your statement looks respectable, your purchasing power looks exhausted. Most people never calculate real loss. They only calculate nominal change. That is why negative real rates are such a beautiful weapon for the state. The saver sees a reward, the system sees a haircut, the asset owner sees an invitation. This is where the identity divide appears. The ordinary consumer says, "At least my money is safe." The serious owner asks, "Safe relative to what?" Safe relative to a volatile stock price for 3 months. Maybe safe relative to a paper asset whose purchasing power is being deliberately shaved year after year while policymakers pretend inflation is weather. Absolutely not. In the 1970s, that destruction became obvious. People who believed a savings account was moral discovered that morality has very little influence over monetary policy. In the post-2008 period, rates were crushed so low that savers effectively lent the government money on humiliating terms. Today, the same broad pattern is returning in a more confusing form. The numbers on paper may look slightly better than zero, but the real return remains insulting when measured against what an actual life costs. This is why I have never liked the sentence, "I am just sitting in cash until things calm down." If the system has reached the point where debt cannot be repaid honestly and the rules are already shifting, calm is the wrong benchmark. The benchmark is purchasing power. If your currency is losing the race against what you must buy to live, then your weight is not neutral. It is not conservative. It is a leak. That is the third signal. Your savings account starts becoming a slow motion disposal system for value. Then comes the fourth signal. And this one is the most revealing of all because it tells you what the people closest to the machine actually believe. The central banks start buying gold. This matters more than any talking head, more than any official forecast, more than any bureaucrat assuring you that price stability remains the mission. When the institutions that print money start exchanging some of that system for gold, they are telling you something no press conference will state cleanly. They are telling you that trust in paper has become too fragile to leave unhedged. They are telling you that reserve managers prefer a harder form of neutrality than another pile of promises from other governments. Watch behavior, not speeches. In the pre-1971 cracks, foreign governments were already exchanging dollars for gold because they understood the peg was alive before the public did. After 2008, central banks moved from selling gold to buying it. Today they have been buyers for years on end and not in token amounts. Large, persistent, strategic accumulation. That is not superstition. It is not nostalgia. It is reserve policy. And reserve policy is where the smartest fear becomes visible. A central bank does not buy gold because it enjoys shiny things. It buys gold because gold sits outside the liabilities of someone else. It buys gold because political promises can be rewritten. But ounces remain stubbornly unimpressed by speeches. It buys gold because, in the final analysis, when debt math breaks, what survives best is not what can be printed more elegantly. It is what cannot be printed at all. So there you have the sequence: debt beyond repayment, rules changing, cash becoming a trap, central banks buying gold. These are not random observations, they are a system. And every major gold move of the last century has walked through that same system before it turned from quiet setup into obvious mania. When gold moved from $20 to $35 after Roosevelt's intervention, it did not happen because the metal suddenly discovered ambition. It happened because the government had already told you the old contract was dead. When gold moved from $35 to $850 after Nixon, it did not happen because people woke up one morning and developed superior taste in metals. It happened because the discipline behind the currency had been broken and the public took time to realize what the break really meant. When gold moved from the low hundreds to $1,900 after 2008, it did not happen because a bunch of mystics got lucky. It happened because balance sheet rescue, money creation, and the humiliation of savers all lined up exactly the way they line up whenever a paper system is forced to confess its own weakness. Now ask yourself what the current environment looks like. Debt is beyond honest repayment. Rules are being altered through law, regulation, emergency framing, and monetary accommodation. Real returns on cash remain poor once you measure them against actual living costs. And central banks are accumulating gold in one of the most aggressive reserve shifts in modern history. Pattern recognition does not require prophecy. It requires memory. That is why I find the present so interesting. Not because I know the exact date gold will move next or the exact level where it will stop. Anyone who claims that kind of precision is usually selling excitement to people who cannot yet distinguish excitement from insight. I am interested because the structure is familiar, the setup is familiar, the sequence is familiar. That does not mean the path will be easy. In fact, gold is one of the least emotionally forgiving assets during a major bull market because it does not move in a straight line. People speak about the 1970s as though gold marched upward with military discipline. It did not. It suffered enormous drawdowns right in the middle of the biggest move. It shook out the impatient, embarrassed the overconfident, and punished anyone who mistook conviction for a substitute for risk management. That is the part I want to be especially honest about. Gold is not a get-rich by Friday instrument. Gold is not a meme stock with more history. Gold is not an excuse to turn your portfolio into a religion. Gold is an insurance asset with explosive tendencies whenever paper trust breaks far enough. Those are not the same thing. The people who do best in gold are usually not the loudest. They size it properly. They understand why they own it. They do not expect it to generate income. They do not expect smoothness. They do not mortgage their judgment to a single narrative and then act betrayed when volatility arrives on schedule. This is why diversification still matters, even in a period when the four signals are flashing brightly. I have always believed that a serious portfolio should still include productive businesses. Stocks still matter because real businesses adapt, reprice, acquire, and grow. Real estate can still matter because land and shelter sit on the real side of the ledger bonds. I would treat much more cautiously in a regime where inflationary temptation remains high and paper promises compete against tangible scarcity. Metals matter because they are the one part of the portfolio that does not require managerial excellence, earnings growth, or faith in a legislature as restraint. That does not mean all in. It means intelligent exposure. If I had to explain the role of gold in a single sentence, I would say this: gold is what you buy when the system begins showing you, piece by piece, that the people running the currency will choose dilution before discipline, and they always prefer dilution. Always, because dilution is politically survivable. Discipline is not. The saver suffers quietly, the taxpayer notices slowly, the asset owner benefits first. And the government gets to say it avoided catastrophe. That is the game. Now, one of the clever ways to participate in a gold move is not through bullion itself, but through miners. But here again, people get themselves into trouble because they hear leverage and think genius. A miner is an operating business. It has management, jurisdiction risk, cost risk, labor issues, energy issues, financing issues, hedging mistakes, and political exposure. It can outperform the metal dramatically when things go right because a higher gold price expands margins much faster than it expands the cost of digging the metal out of the ground. But that same operating leverage cuts both ways. If gold rises 25%, the run miner's profits can rise by much more than 25% because its costs do not rise at the same pace. That is how fortunes get made in the miners. It is also how people lose their discipline and start mistaking a cyclical instrument for a permanent one. The point is not to worship the leverage. The point is to understand it. My own instinct is still to think in layers: physical or physically backed exposure for ballast, select miners for torque, operating businesses elsewhere in the portfolio for productive resilience, enough liquidity to avoid becoming a forced seller. That is how grown-ups do this. Not by posting dramatic slogans and pretending prudence is cowardice. I have seen too many cycles to be fooled by financial theater. Every generation thinks its euphemisms are new. Every government thinks its interventions are more sophisticated than the old blunt tools. Every saver thinks this time, perhaps, caution in cash will be rewarded. Every policymaker thinks the inflation can be managed just enough to avoid revolt while still eroding the debt in real terms. But the sequence does not care about their self-image. First, the debt grows past redemption. Then the rules change. Then cash stops protecting. Then the smartest reserve managers start moving. Then gold stops looking like a relic and starts looking like a mirror. And that is what gold really is in moments like these, a mirror. It reflects the weakness of the paper system far better than it reflects its own intrinsic excitement. People talk about gold exploding. Gold does not really explode. Confidence in paper decays. Gold simply reprices that decay more honestly than politicians do. That is why I care. That is why I think this setup matters. And that is why I would rather be early and properly sized than late and suddenly philosophical about what I should have done. The public usually notices gold too late. They notice it after the first move. They notice it after the central banks have already acted. They notice it after the real returns on cash have humiliated them for years. They notice it after the rules have already been changed enough times to become a pattern rather than an exception. By then, the work has already been done. The intelligent part of the return almost always belongs to the people willing to study the signals before the crowd studies the chart. So here is the question I would leave you with. Not whether gold will go up tomorrow. Not whether some bank strategist has a target. Not whether a retracement will scare weak hands next quarter. The real question is simpler and harder. If debt is unpayable, if rules are being rewritten, if cash is leaking in real terms, and if central banks are telling you what they think through their buying, what exactly are you waiting for before you admit the system has already started confessing? Because once you admit that, the rest of the decision gets much clearer. You do not have to become a fanatic. You do not have to become a prophet. You simply have to stop pretending the paper system still deserves the same unquestioning trust it had before the four signals began flashing. That alone can save a fortune, and in certain decades, it can build one.